For thousands of years, emperors, mystics, and secret societies guarded a quiet, unsettling idea. Reality is not as solid as people believe, but something far more fluid. Most people unknowingly recreate the same suffering for decades, moving through different places, faces, and circumstances, yet tracing the same invisible patterns carved deep within the mind. Life appears to change on the surface, but beneath it, the same reactions, fears, and assumptions quietly script the same outcomes again and again. Desperate manifestation fails in the very moment it is driven by lack. The mind that grasps, chases, and pleads is already rooted in absence, and so it can only reproduce more of what it believes to be true. Intention without inner alignment becomes noise, effort without transformation. What is sought with urgency often slips further away, not by fate, but by the silent logic of the inner state. Ancient initiates understood something most have forgotten. The outer world is not conquered by force, but reflected by consciousness. To master the mind was seen as a greater victory than ruling empires, because the one who governs their inner world no longer lives as a servant to circumstance. They become the source rather than the effect. One realization changes everything. Nothing external has ever been the true cause of one's experience. The patterns within, beliefs, perceptions, and states of being, are the architects of reality. Shift the inner foundation, and the outer world reorganizes itself accordingly. Today, you'll uncover the forbidden principles hidden across Hermeticism, Taoism, Stoicism, and ancient mystical traditions that claim your identity silently shapes your destiny. Before we go any further, consider this carefully. Have you ever noticed how your worst fears often come true, and your strongest beliefs quietly shape your life? Pause for a moment and remember a time when you expected something to happen, and somehow, reality followed that expectation. Chapter 1. Hermes Trismegistus and the Secret Science of Reality. There are names that history remembers clearly, and then there are names that history hides behind shadows. Hermes Trismegistus belongs to the second category. Some believed he was a man, others believed he was a symbol created from the merging of the Egyptian god Thoth and the Greek god Hermes. But across centuries, one idea remained disturbingly consistent. Hidden inside the teachings associated with Hermes was a science of consciousness so powerful that only initiates were permitted to study it deeply. In the ancient temples of Egypt, long before modern psychology gave names to mental conditioning and perception bias, priests taught selected students that reality was not experienced directly. It was filtered through the mind. The student entering these mystery schools was not immediately taught rituals or mystical ceremonies. First they were taught observation, silence, attention, emotional restraint, because the ancients believed a chaotic mind could not perceive truth clearly. A disturbed consciousness distorted reality the way ripples distort reflection on water. The Hermetic teachings later summarized this understanding through one famous phrase, "As within, so without." Most people hear those words and reduce them to motivational poetry. The ancient initiates treated them as law. They believed the outer world continuously reflected the structure of the inner world, not magically, not instantly, but psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, and behaviorally. The angry man saw enemies everywhere. The fearful man saw danger in opportunity. The resentful man recreated betrayal repeatedly because his perception had already prepared him to expect it. Reality bends quietly. A story preserved through fragments of Hermetic tradition tells of a young initiate brought before an older master deep within an underground temple chamber. The student complained that life itself opposed him. Every effort failed. Every relationship collapsed. Every ambition dissolved into frustration. The master listened silently, then handed the student a bronze mirror covered in dust. "Clean it," he said. The student wiped the surface carefully until his reflection appeared. The master asked, "Did the mirror change your face?" The initiate answered no. "Then understand this," the master whispered. "The world has been reflecting you long before you noticed the mirror." The student expected hidden rituals. Instead, he was assigned something painfully simple. For 40 days he was ordered to observe every repeated emotional pattern inside himself, every complaint, every fear, every assumption, every imagined humiliation, every rehearsed resentment. Slowly he realized his inner world was not reacting to reality, it was helping construct his experience of it. His thoughts shaped his posture, tone, decisions, expectations, relationships, risks, and interpretations. He carried invisible architecture inside him, and that architecture quietly organized his life. Most people never notice this. A man convinced he is powerless unconsciously avoids opportunities requiring confidence. A woman who believes betrayal is inevitable interprets silence as rejection. Someone emotionally addicted to struggle often feels uncomfortable in peace and unknowingly recreates conflict. The ancient Hermeticists understood something modern society constantly ignores. Consciousness influences behavior long before behavior shapes results. The mind becomes atmosphere. This is why the mystery schools protected mental discipline so aggressively. They believed undisciplined thought weakened perception itself. Modern life encourages constant emotional stimulation, fear, outrage, distraction, comparison. But ancient initiates considered emotional chaos a form of spiritual blindness. A scattered mind could not perceive reality clearly because it interpreted everything through instability. A Hermetic teacher once described human beings as living magnets of interpretation, not because thoughts magically controlled the universe like fantasy, but because perception directs attention. Attention shapes behavior, behavior influences patterns, and patterns eventually harden into experience. The person who constantly anticipates humiliation notices every sign of rejection while ignoring evidence of acceptance. Fear narrows vision, confidence expands it. Attention quietly edits reality. That changes everything. The modern world often teaches people to fight external circumstances endlessly while ignoring the condition of the inner world generating their responses. Hermetic philosophy reversed this approach entirely. The initiate first mastered thought, emotion, and interpretation before attempting to influence the outer world. Internal order preceded external clarity. There is another reason these teachings were called forbidden. They remove excuses. If consciousness influences experience, then each person becomes partially responsible for the emotional atmosphere they carry through life. That realization can feel liberating or terrifying depending on the individual. Many people prefer believing reality alone controls them because responsibility for the inner world feels heavier than blaming circumstances. But the ancient sages believed freedom begins precisely there. One Hermetic fragment describes the human mind as a garden constantly seeded by repetition. Whatever thoughts are emotionally rehearsed eventually sink below awareness and begin directing behavior automatically. Fear repeated becomes temperament. Bitterness repeated becomes identity. Gratitude repeated becomes perception. The mind obeys repetition, whether the pattern is constructive or destructive. The hidden danger is subtle. People often assume thoughts are harmless because thoughts are invisible, yet invisible forces shape visible destinies constantly. A building begins as a blueprint, a war begins as an idea, a relationship begins as interpretation. A civilization rises or collapses first through collective belief. Thought is not passive. Thought organizes action, and action organizes reality. The Hermetic initiate, therefore, practiced a discipline unfamiliar to modern culture, deliberate observation of thought, not suppression, not denial, observation. Because whatever remains unconscious eventually gains control. The moment a person notices repeated fear, resentment, envy, or hopelessness operating automatically, consciousness itself begins interrupting the pattern. Awareness weakens unconscious control. The ancients understood this long before modern neuroscience explained habitual pathways and emotional conditioning. Different language, same truth. So tonight, before searching for hidden power in rituals, symbols, or mystical promises, begin where the ancient initiates began. Observe the atmosphere of your own mind carefully. Listen to the emotional tone repeated throughout the day. Notice which assumptions dominate your perception. Observe how expectation quietly shapes interpretation. Because reality may not simply be happening around you, it may also be responding through you, and the first Hermetic law remains unchanged after thousands of years. The inner world is never separate from the outer one. Treat your thoughts like living forces. Chapter 2. The dangerous illusion of external power. Most people spend their entire lives worshipping appearances without realizing it. A bank account changes, and their identity changes with it. Someone criticizes them, and their emotional state collapses instantly. A relationship ends, and they begin questioning their value as a human being. External conditions become invisible rulers governing inner peace. The ancients considered this one of the greatest forms of slavery. Not physical slavery, psychological slavery. A Stoic teacher once watched a wealthy merchant panic after losing several ships during a violent storm. The man screamed at servants, cursed the gods, and wandered through his home like someone already dead. Finally, the teacher asked him a strange question. Did the storm steal your ships, or did it steal your mind first? The merchant could not answer. But the question remained. Most suffering begins there. External events possess enormous influence over people because few individuals ever learn to separate circumstances from identity. They fuse together. Success becomes self-worth. Failure becomes shame. Rejection becomes proof of inadequacy. Fear becomes prophecy. The outer world continuously dictates the inner one, and this creates dangerous blindness. Fear-based thinking narrows perception until people stop seeing possibilities entirely. A person emotionally consumed by scarcity overlooks opportunity because anxiety dominates attention. Someone convinced the world is hostile interprets neutral events as threats. Emotional reactions quietly rewrite reality in real time. The prison becomes invisible. Hermetic thinkers, Stoics, Taoists, and Sufi mystics all warned about this same phenomenon using different language. They understood that unconscious emotional obedience weakens awareness itself. The reactive person cannot perceive clearly because emotion has already distorted interpretation before conscious thought begins. Reaction becomes reality. A Taoist story tells of a farmer whose horse ran away. His neighbors rushed to pity him. Terrible misfortune, they said. The farmer calmly replied, "Maybe." Days later, the horse returned with several wild horses beside it. The neighbors celebrated his luck. Again, the farmer answered, "Maybe." Later, his son broke his leg while training one of the horses. The neighbors mourned his tragedy. "Maybe," the farmer repeated. Soon afterward, soldiers arrived to conscript young men into war, but his injured son was spared. The story survives because it exposes a truth most people resist. External appearances constantly deceive emotional judgment. Yet modern culture trains people to react immediately to everything: headlines, arguments, social comparison, financial fluctuations, approval, rejection. Outrage spreads faster than wisdom because emotional reaction is addictive, and the more reactive a mind becomes, the easier it is to manipulate. That is why external dependence weakens consciousness. The person who requires constant validation becomes controlled by opinion. The person addicted to comfort becomes terrified of uncertainty. The person emotionally dependent on outcomes loses clarity the moment reality refuses cooperation. Their inner world rises and collapses with external events, like a leaf trapped in violent wind. But the ancient traditions taught something radically different. Power begins when perception becomes disciplined, not coldness, not emotional suppression. Discipline. Marcus Aurelius ruled during plague, political betrayal, famine and war, yet repeatedly wrote reminders to himself that external events alone did not create suffering. Interpretation completed the process. The Stoics understood that while circumstances influence life, emotional surrender to circumstances destroys sovereignty entirely. The same principle appears in Hermetic philosophy. Reality reflects inner order partly because perception directs behavior. Two individuals may encounter identical hardship while producing entirely different futures. One collapses inwardly. The other adapts, learns, reorganizes, and grows stronger. Circumstances matter, but consciousness determines response. And response changes destiny. This is why fear becomes so dangerous when repeated continuously. Fear does not simply create discomfort. It reorganizes perception itself. It trains attention toward threat, conditions the nervous system toward defensiveness, and slowly reshapes identity around limitation. Eventually, the person stops merely feeling fear. They become identified with it. The ancients believed this unconscious identification was the true prison, not external reality itself. A Sufi mystic once said, "The cage was never locked. The bird simply feared the sky." That sentence contains centuries of psychological truth. Many people remain trapped not because opportunity is absent, but because fear has conditioned them to emotionally obey appearances before testing deeper possibilities. The solution is not denial of reality. Ancient wisdom never taught naive fantasy. Hermetic thinkers did not ignore hardship. Stoics did not pretend pain was pleasant. Taoists did not deny difficulty exists. The real teaching was subtler. Do not allow appearances to become absolute rulers of consciousness. See clearly. Respond consciously. That changes everything. The moment a person stops emotionally kneeling before temporary circumstances, perception widens. Creativity returns, clarity returns, choice returns. Instead of reacting automatically, the individual begins participating consciously in experience. And this may be the first true step toward bending reality, not controlling the external world through fantasy, but refusing to let appearances dominate the inner world completely. Because the mind that obeys every external condition can never become free. Stop emotionally obeying appearances. Chapter 3. Stoicism and the Inner Kingdom. Marcus Aurelius wrote some of the most profound reflections on inner mastery while surrounded by conditions that would psychologically destroy most people. War consumed the Roman Empire. Disease spread through entire cities. Political betrayal surrounded him constantly. Death, uncertainty, and instability became daily realities, yet inside his private writings, later collected as meditations, appears a man relentlessly training his own mind not to become enslaved by external chaos. That alone is extraordinary. Most people imagine power as influence over circumstances. The Stoics defined power differently. To them, the highest form of strength was sovereignty over one's own perception. A person unable to govern emotion, reaction, impulse, and interpretation could never truly become free, regardless of wealth or status. The real kingdom was internal. A story from the Stoic tradition describes a philosopher calmly observing the destruction of his property during political unrest. Friends around him panicked while soldiers looted homes nearby. Yet the philosopher remained strangely composed. Someone finally asked how he could remain calm while losing so much. He answered, "They may disturb my house, but only I can disturb my mind." The sentence feels almost impossible to modern thinking. Today, external conditions dominate emotional life for many people completely. Social approval controls confidence. Financial shifts control identity. Criticism controls mood. Political news controls peace. The Stoics considered this unconscious dependency a dangerous weakness because anything controlling the mind controls the individual. Marcus Aurelius understood this intimately. As emperor, he could not stop every war, prevent every disease, or eliminate human betrayal, but he believed he always possessed authority over one thing: his response. Again and again, he reminded himself that suffering expands when interpretation becomes undisciplined, events are neutral, meaning is added internally. That idea appears simple until life becomes difficult. Anyone can speak calmly during comfort. Stoicism was forged in pressure. The philosophy was not designed for monasteries detached from struggle, but for rulers, soldiers, merchants, and ordinary citizens navigating uncertainty directly, and uncertainty reveals character. The Stoics observed how quickly emotion distorts perception. Anger exaggerates insult. Fear magnifies danger. Desire clouds judgment. Resentment poisons interpretation. Once emotion dominates consciousness, reality itself becomes distorted. The reactive person stops seeing clearly because inner turbulence rewrites experience before reason has time to respond. Reaction becomes prison. A Stoic teacher once compared uncontrolled emotion to muddy water. Stir the water violently, and nothing can be seen clearly. Leave it undisturbed, and clarity returns naturally. The same principle applies psychologically. Emotional overreaction clouds intelligence. Calmness restores perspective. This is why Stoicism placed enormous emphasis on pause, not suppression, not numbness, pause. Between external events and emotional reaction exists a small space where consciousness can intervene. Most people never notice it because reactions occur automatically through conditioning. Someone insults them and anger erupts immediately. A problem appears and panic takes control instantly. But Stoic training attempted to widen that space deliberately. Freedom lives there. Epictetus, born into slavery before becoming one of history's most influential Stoic teachers, taught that external conditions matter far less than the interpretations attached to them. A free man psychologically enslaved by fear remains imprisoned internally. A poor man governed by wisdom may possess greater peace than a wealthy person consumed by anxiety. The Stoics therefore trained themselves to separate what could be controlled from what could not. Reputation, weather, politics, other people's opinions, unexpected events, these remained unstable and ultimately uncontrollable. But attention, interpretation, discipline, and character belonged within the inner kingdom. and the inner kingdom determined resilience. Modern culture often confuses emotional impulsiveness with authenticity. The Stoics saw uncontrolled emotionality as vulnerability. A person who reacts blindly to every circumstance becomes predictable and easily manipulated. Insults provoke them instantly. Fear controls decisions. Praise inflates ego. Criticism destroys confidence. External forces pull the strings. But the Stoic path sought emotional stability through awareness. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminded himself that external events alone do not define suffering. The mind's interpretation completes the experience. Two people can endure identical hardship while producing entirely different inner realities. One collapses. One transforms. This is not fantasy optimism. Stoicism never denied pain. The Stoics acknowledged grief, hardship, loss, and injustice fully. Their insight was deeper. Emotional resistance to reality often creates greater suffering than reality itself. Accept clearly. Respond wisely. A Roman general once reportedly asked a Stoic philosopher how he remained calm during political instability. The philosopher answered, "Because I trained during peace for the arrival of chaos." That training involved constant observation of thought, emotional restraint, voluntary discomfort, reflection on mortality, and disciplined attention. Inner mastery required practice, and perhaps that is the hidden connection between Stoicism and Hermeticism. Both traditions believed consciousness shapes experience profoundly. One emphasized mental discipline through philosophical clarity. The other explored symbolic and spiritual laws, yet both warned about the same danger. A person governed entirely by external appearances loses sovereignty over life itself. The world outside will always fluctuate. Markets rise and collapse. Relationships begin and end. Health changes. Public opinion shifts. Unexpected hardship appears without permission. The Stoics understood that searching for permanent stability externally guarantees suffering, because external reality remains unstable by nature. But internal discipline creates another kind of stability. A calm mind interprets differently. A disciplined person responds differently. Someone emotionally governed by wisdom perceives possibilities panic cannot see. Clarity survives where reactivity collapses. That is real strength. So the next time emotion surges violently through your mind, resist the urge to react immediately. Pause first. Observe the interpretation forming internally. Ask whether perception itself has become distorted by fear, anger, pride, or insecurity, because the ancient Stoics believed one truth above all. Whoever rules the inner kingdom eventually changes the outer one. Chapter 4, Wu Wei, the secret of effortless manifestation. One of the strangest truths hidden inside ancient Taoist philosophy is that the harder many people chase control, the further clarity moves away from them. Modern culture teaches constant force, push harder, obsess more, dominate outcomes, control every possibility, but Taoism warned that excessive force often creates resistance instead of harmony. The ancient masters called this imbalance the failure to understand Wu Wei. Effortless action. Most people misunderstand that phrase immediately. They assume it means laziness, passivity, or avoiding responsibility. But the Taoist sages meant something entirely different. Wu Wei described a state where action emerges from alignment rather than desperation, movement without inner friction, effort without psychological struggle, action guided by clarity instead of fear. The difference is enormous. A famous Taoist story tells of an old farmer watching a young man attempt to pull sprouts from the earth so they would grow faster. The young man believed more force would create quicker results. By sunset, every sprout had withered. The farmer quietly said, "What grows naturally survives naturally." The lesson spread through Taoist teaching for centuries because it exposed one of the deepest psychological traps in human behavior. People often destroy outcomes through emotional gripping. Desperation distorts perception. Consider how fear behaves inside the human mind. When someone becomes obsessed with obtaining a relationship, money, recognition, or success, their awareness narrows. They overanalyze. They cling emotionally to every sign. They force conversations, pressure timing, misread silence, and exhaust themselves internally. Their energy becomes unstable. Opportunities that required patience, openness, or calm perception disappear beneath emotional urgency. The tighter the grip, the weaker the clarity. Ancient Taoists observed this constantly in rulers, warriors, merchants, and ordinary villagers. The desperate ruler became tyrannical and created rebellion. The desperate warrior lost awareness during battle because fear controlled his perception. The desperate merchant made reckless decisions because anxiety overpowered judgment. Emotional force clouded intelligence. A calm mind sees farther. This is why Taoism repeatedly uses water as its central metaphor. Water does not fight the mountain directly, yet over time it shapes stone itself. It adapts without losing direction. It flows around obstacles instead of exhausting itself through resistance. Softness becomes power precisely because softness remains flexible. The rigid branch breaks during storms. The flexible branch survives. There is profound psychological wisdom hidden inside that image. Many people trying to manifest a new reality secretly operate from fear rather than trust. They obsess over signs. They panic when results do not appear immediately. They emotionally depend on outcomes for identity and self-worth. But Taoist philosophy warns that emotional attachment itself becomes interference. The mind consumed by urgency loses connection with the present moment entirely, and the present moment is where clear action exists. A wandering Taoist teacher once visited a village suffering through drought. The villagers begged him to pray for rain because they believed he possessed mystical powers. Instead of performing rituals immediately, the teacher isolated himself quietly in a small hut outside the village for several days. Eventually, rain arrived naturally. When villagers asked how he caused it, the teacher reportedly answered, "I did not force the rain. I restored harmony within myself. When inner disorder ended, harmony returned around me." Whether literal or symbolic, the story survived because it reflects the Taoist understanding of consciousness. Internal imbalance spreads outward through perception, action, and emotional atmosphere. Calmness reorganizes behavior differently than panic. Clarity produces different decisions than desperation. Flow creates openings force cannot. That changes everything. Modern society rewards frantic energy so aggressively that stillness feels unnatural to many people. Constant productivity, constant comparison, constant stimulation. People become addicted to emotional struggle because struggle creates the illusion of control. Yet Taoism teaches that true power often appears quieter than forceful personalities expect. The archer hits the target best when tension disappears from the body. The musician performs beautifully after overthinking vanishes. Athletes describe flow states where action becomes effortless because self-conscious fear dissolves. Creativity emerges naturally when obsession relaxes. In each case, performance improves not through emotional gripping but through alignment. Wu Wei, this principle applies deeply to human relationships as well. Someone desperately chasing approval unconsciously radiates insecurity. Another person calm within themselves often attracts trust naturally because they are not emotionally forcing connection. One individual manipulates constantly out of fear of rejection, while another allows relationships to develop organically through presence and authenticity. Desperation repels. Stability attracts. The Taoists understood something modern culture rarely admits. Forcing outcomes often signals internal distrust. Beneath obsessive control usually lies fear. Fear of uncertainty, fear of loss, fear of not being enough. Emotional grasping becomes an attempt to overpower insecurity externally rather than resolve it internally. But unresolved fear cannot create peace. This does not mean abandoning goals. Taoism never taught passive surrender to life. The sages planted crops, built homes, defended villages, and governed kingdoms. They acted deliberately. The difference was psychological. They acted without becoming emotionally imprisoned by outcomes. They moved with reality instead of violently against it. That is subtle wisdom. There is a powerful distinction between intention and attachment. Intention provides direction. Attachment creates suffering. The Taoist moves toward desired outcomes while remaining internally flexible enough to adapt, observe, and remain calm when reality shifts unexpectedly. Because reality always shifts, one ancient parable tells of a fisherman whose net repeatedly returned empty while he cursed the river in frustration. An older fisherman nearby remained calm despite catching little himself. Finally, the angry man demanded, "Why are you not upset?" The elder replied, "Because the river does not obey anger. I watch the current instead." That single sentence contains the essence of wu-wei. Stop fighting the river. Many people trying to transform their lives remain psychologically at war with the present moment. They hate where they are so intensely that they poison their ability to move clearly toward where they wish to go. Fear clouds timing. Emotional pressure destroys perception. Obsession blinds intuition. Calmness restores intelligence. The Taoist path, therefore, teaches intentional action without emotional gripping. Move toward the goal, but do not emotionally collapse if timing changes. Desire growth, but do not worship outcomes. Act decisively, but remain internally flexible. Let awareness breathe. Flow is power. The paradox is almost uncomfortable. Many things arrive more naturally when desperation ends. Opportunities become visible. Relationships improve. Creativity returns. Perception sharpens. Emotional energy stabilizes. Not because the universe suddenly grants magical rewards, but because consciousness itself becomes less distorted by fear. And a clear mind moves differently through reality than a desperate one ever can. Raelius' emotional force. Chapter 5, The First Gate. As within, so without. There is a sentence hidden inside Hermetic philosophy that has survived the collapse of empires, the burning of libraries, and the disappearance of entire civilizations. It appears simple when first heard, yet ancient initiates believed it contained one of the deepest laws governing human experience. As within, so without. Most people interpret those words superficially. The Hermetic sages did not. To them, this principle described the mysterious mirror between inner consciousness and outer reality. The external world was not viewed as separate from the internal one. Thoughts influenced emotion. Emotion shaped perception. Perception guided behavior. Behavior created patterns. Patterns hardened into destiny. The outer life slowly became a visible reflection of invisible inner structures. The mirror never sleeps. A story from ancient Alexandria tells of a young scholar who traveled through several kingdoms, searching for secret knowledge capable of changing his life. He studied sacred symbols, memorized ancient prayers, and collected fragments of mystical teachings, yet his suffering followed him everywhere. Every city became another version of the same emotional prison. Finally, an older Hermetic teacher invited him into a quiet chamber lit only by oil lamps. The teacher placed 2 bowls of water before him. One bowl remained still. The other was violently disturbed by constant motion. "What do you see?" the teacher asked. "In one bowl I see my reflection clearly," the student replied. "In the other everything is distorted." The old teacher nodded slowly. "And now you understand why your life appears chaotic." The wisdom was psychological before it was mystical. The Hermeticists believed many people misread reality because they never examine the emotional atmosphere through which they interpret existence. Fear distorts perception. Bitterness filters experience. Shame alters behavior. Resentment attracts conflict because the mind unconsciously searches for evidence confirming its emotional state. The inner world becomes a lens shaping the meaning assigned to events. Reality reflects consciousness quietly. This does not mean every external hardship is magically created by thought alone. Ancient Hermeticism was more mature than simplistic fantasy. Storms exist, illness exists, loss exists, but the Hermetic teaching focused on something deeper. 2 people may face identical circumstances while living entirely different realities internally. One collapses into despair. Another transforms suffering into wisdom. External conditions matter, but inner structure determines response, and response changes destiny. A bitter person walks into opportunity already expecting betrayal. A fearful person encounters change and immediately sees danger instead of possibility. Someone internally governed by insecurity unconsciously recreates emotional environments matching their self-concept. The Hermetic sages observed these patterns long before modern psychology explained conditioning and cognitive bias. Inner disorder creates outer confusion. That is why ancient mystery schools emphasized self-observation before power. Students were trained to monitor emotional habits carefully because repeated inner states eventually shaped identity itself. Anger practiced daily becomes temperament. Fear rehearsed constantly becomes worldview. Gratitude cultivated intentionally changes perception. Thought repeated emotionally becomes belief, and belief quietly reorganizes behavior. The process is subtle. Most people believe reality changes them while ignoring how constantly they are participating in reality through interpretation. The anxious mind notices threats first. The ashamed mind notices rejection first. The confident mind notices opportunity first. Attention edits experience continuously. The mirror responds accordingly. A wandering Sufi mystic once compared human consciousness to colored glass held before sunlight. The light itself remains pure, he said, but every person colors it differently. The same principle appears in Hermeticism. Reality arrives, but interpretation shapes experience. The external world interacts constantly with internal condition. This becomes especially dangerous when unconscious emotional patterns dominate awareness. Someone emotionally addicted to conflict unknowingly creates tension wherever they go. Another person consumed by scarcity begins making fearful decisions that reinforce limitation. A mind trained by disappointment expects failure and unconsciously behaves in ways confirming it. The prophecy fulfills itself. Modern society rarely teaches people to examine their internal world deeply. Most attention is directed outward toward possessions, approval, achievement, comparison, distraction. Yet Hermetic philosophy insisted the outer world could never become stable while the inner world remained chaotic. The first gate was internal mastery. One ancient initiate reportedly spent years performing a seemingly meaningless practice before receiving deeper teachings. Each evening, he was ordered to sit silently and review the emotional states he carried throughout the day. Where did anger appear? Where did fear distort perception? Where did pride control behavior? At first, the practice frustrated him. He wanted mystical rituals, hidden symbols, secret powers. Instead, he was being taught awareness. Eventually, he understood why. The greatest prison was unconsciousness itself. Most emotional reactions occur automatically because conditioning operates beneath awareness. People become identified with fear, resentment, envy, shame, and insecurity without questioning whether those patterns are objectively true. The inner world hardens into personality. Personality shapes decisions. Decisions shape life conditions. Slowly, the internal becomes externalized. As within, so without. That sentence is not merely spiritual poetry, it is a warning. The ancient Hermetic teachers believed individuals unable to govern their internal world would inevitably become governed by external circumstances. Fearful minds are manipulated easily. Reactive minds lose clarity quickly. Emotionally unstable people create unstable environments because internal disorder spreads outward through speech, decisions, relationships, and perception. Inner mastery changes this entirely. When awareness increases, reaction slows. When reaction slows, perception sharpens. When perception sharpens, behavior becomes intentional rather than impulsive. The person no longer moves through life mechanically. Conscious participation begins replacing unconscious repetition. That changes everything. A Taoist sage once wrote that muddy water becomes clear not through force but through stillness. Hermetic wisdom echoes the same truth. Clarity emerges when inner turbulence quiets. Reality begins appearing differently because consciousness itself becomes less distorted. And perhaps this is why ancient initiates protected these teachings so carefully. They understood that the greatest transformation does not begin by controlling the external world. It begins by recognizing the hidden relationship between consciousness and experience. The outer world mirrors the inner one continuously. Stabilize the inner world first. Chapter 6. The Invisible Sculptor. Most people imagine thoughts as fleeting shadows passing harmlessly through the mind. Ancient philosophers, mystics, and psychologists believed something far more unsettling. Thoughts are not passive observers of reality. They are shaping forces. Invisible sculptors carving identity, behavior, emotion, and eventually experience itself. Every civilization that studied consciousness deeply arrived at some version of this understanding. The Hermeticists taught that thought energy influences perception and action. The Stoics warned that repeated interpretations shape character. The Sufis believed inner states veil or reveal truth. Modern psychology now explains that repeated thoughts strengthen neural pathways, conditioning the brain towards certain emotional and behavioral patterns. Different language. Same warning. What repeats internally eventually manifests externally. A sculptor once lived near an ancient temple, according to a forgotten parable from the Eastern Mediterranean. Villagers admired the statues he created from stone and asked how he produced such lifelike beauty. The sculptor answered strangely, "The statue already exists inside the stone. I only remove what does not belong." Years later, a Hermetic teacher used this story to explain the human mind. Identity, he claimed, is sculpted through repeated thought. Every fear rehearsed strengthens limitation. Every empowering belief strengthens possibility. Consciousness continuously chisels reality from within. Thought becomes architecture. The danger is that most people sculpt unconsciously. Someone repeatedly thinking, "Nothing ever works for me," begins behaving differently without noticing it. Energy lowers, risk decreases, confidence weakens. Opportunities are dismissed prematurely. Failure becomes expected. Another person constantly rehearsing resentment interprets neutral situations defensively and slowly creates the very hostility they fear. Invisible beliefs create visible patterns. A merchant in ancient Greece once became convinced his business would collapse after hearing rumors of economic decline. Though his shop remained stable initially, fear consumed him daily. He stopped investing in quality goods. He distrusted loyal customers. He treated workers harshly out of anxiety. Within a year, the business collapsed exactly as he feared. The tragedy was not mystical punishment. His thoughts altered his behavior until the feared outcome materialized naturally. The mind participates in reality constantly. Modern neuroscience confirms something ancient wisdom understood intuitively. The brain filters information according to dominant expectation. People notice evidence matching repeated beliefs while ignoring contradictory evidence. Attention becomes selective. The fearful mind sees danger. The insecure mind sees rejection. The hopeful mind sees openings others overlook. Belief guides perception. This is why ancient mystery schools guarded mental discipline so fiercely. The initiates believed uncontrolled thought weakened consciousness itself. A person constantly rehearsing fear eventually lives inside fear, regardless of external conditions. Emotional repetition becomes identity. Identity directs behavior automatically, and behavior shapes destiny. One Hermetic teacher described the human mind as fertile soil, incapable of refusing seeds. Whatever thoughts are planted repeatedly, whether constructive or destructive, eventually take root. The mind does not carefully judge every repeated idea emotionally impressed upon it. It absorbs patterns through repetition. Fear repeated becomes expectation. Shame repeated becomes personality. Confidence repeated becomes posture. Gratitude repeated becomes worldview. The invisible sculptor never stops working. A Sufi mystic once warned his students, "Be careful what you repeat inside yourself." The soul listens. Though poetic, the statement contains enormous psychological truth. Internal dialogue influences emotional state continuously. People often speak to themselves with greater cruelty than they would ever direct toward another human being. Over time, those repeated internal messages become accepted as reality. The prison becomes internalized. Ancient teachings therefore emphasized conscious speech, conscious thought, and conscious attention, not because every thought magically alters the universe instantly, but because repeated thought reshapes the person experiencing reality. And when identity changes, behavior changes. When behavior changes, outcomes begin shifting naturally. This is practical wisdom disguised as mysticism. A man convinced he is weak unconsciously avoids challenge. Another who believes growth is possible responds differently to failure. One person interprets rejection as permanent defeat. Another interprets it as temporary feedback. The external event may be identical, yet the internal meaning changes behavior entirely. The invisible sculptor shapes both worlds. There is also a deeper layer to this principle. Thoughts influence not only individual behavior, but emotional atmosphere itself. Anyone entering a room can often sense tension, bitterness, peace, or joy before words are spoken. Human beings radiate psychological states constantly through posture, tone, attention, and energy. The inner world leaks outward continuously. Nothing remains hidden completely. This is why emotionally disciplined individuals often influence environments without force. Calmness stabilizes groups. Fear spreads panic. Confidence reassures others. Emotional states ripple outward socially and psychologically. The ancients understood that consciousness interacts collectively as well as individually. Energy communicates silently. But perhaps the most dangerous illusion modern people believe is that occasional positive thinking alone changes life automatically. Ancient wisdom never taught shallow optimism detached from discipline. The real transformation comes through sustained repetition powerful enough to alter identity itself. That requires awareness. An old Hermetic exercise instructed initiates to examine recurring thoughts before sleep each night. Which thoughts dominated today? Which emotions repeated most? Which assumptions shaped interpretation? The purpose was not guilt but recognition. Whatever remains unconscious controls behavior invisibly. Awareness interrupts the sculptor's unconscious work. And once awareness appears, intentional creation becomes possible. A person can begin redirecting emotional patterns instead of obeying them automatically. Fear can become caution instead of paralysis. Anger can become discipline instead of destruction. Limitation can become challenge instead of identity. The sculptor changes tools. The ancient traditions agreed on one profound truth. Reality is influenced not merely by external events, but by the consciousness interpreting and responding to those events continuously. Thought is never entirely passive. It is shaping you every day. Choose your inner architecture carefully. Chapter 7. The One Truth Behind All. What if every great spiritual tradition, Hermeticism, Stoicism, Taoism, Sufism, the Upanishads, was not describing different truths, but different languages pointing to the same hidden reality? This is the unsettling idea at the heart of the perennial philosophy, that beneath all religious symbols, philosophical systems, and mystical teachings, there is a single underlying principle shaping human experience, not a doctrine, not a belief system, but a direct recognition of how consciousness relates to reality itself. Ancient teachers did not always agree on words, but they often converged on experience. Hermeticists spoke of mind. Upanishadic sages spoke of Brahman. Stoics spoke of Logos. Taoists spoke of the way. Sufis spoke of divine unity beyond separation. Different cultures, same direction of pointing. A traveler once arrived at a distant monastery after years of wandering through multiple philosophical schools. He expected contradiction, conflicting teachings, competing truths, confusion between systems. Instead, he found something unexpected. Each teacher, despite different rituals and language, eventually led him back to the same instruction. Observe the mind itself, not the world first. The mind interpreting the world. One teacher would say, detach from desire. Another would say, return to the Tao. Another would say, examine your judgments. Another would say, know yourself. Beneath each instruction was a shared recognition. Experience is filtered through consciousness before it becomes reality. That is the hidden thread. The perennial philosophy does not claim all beliefs are identical. It suggests something more subtle and more powerful, that all genuine wisdom traditions converge on the realization that consciousness is not a passive observer of life, but the active interpreter shaping it moment by moment. The outer world does not arrive fully formed as reality. It arrives as raw experience, and consciousness organizes it into meaning. Meaning becomes lived experience. A merchant in ancient Phoenicia once visited 3 different temples in search of divine guidance after losing his wealth in a storm. In the first temple, priests told him the gods were punishing him. In the second, they told him chaos was part of cosmic balance. In the third, a silent mystic simply asked him, "What story are you choosing to believe about your suffering?" That question changed him more than any doctrine, because suddenly he realized something critical. The same event can be interpreted in radically different ways, and each interpretation leads to a different emotional reality. One interpretation creates despair, another creates acceptance, another creates resilience. The event itself did not change. The mind did. This is where the perennial philosophy becomes psychologically radical. It shifts attention from external conditions to internal interpretation. It suggests that human beings are constantly participating in reality construction through perception, belief, attention, and emotional response. Not in a fantasy sense, but in a lived, psychological sense where meaning determines experience. Two people can stand in the same rainstorm. One feels cursed, the other feels cleansed. The difference is not in the rain. It is in consciousness assigning meaning to sensation, and meaning shapes behavior. The Stoics recognized this clearly. The Taoists expressed it through harmony. The Hermeticists encoded it as mental laws. The Sufis dissolved it into love and unity. The Upanishads transcended it into pure awareness. Yet all pathways converge toward the same insight. Reality is never experienced directly without interpretation. Consciousness always arrives first. Modern psychology now echoes this ancient convergence. Cognitive science shows that perception is not a direct recording of external reality, but a constructed experience shaped by expectations, beliefs, memory, and emotional state. The brain does not simply see the world, it interprets signals and builds a coherent narrative. We live inside interpretation. This is why two people can argue endlessly about the same situation, while experiencing entirely different realities. They are not reacting to the event itself. They are reacting to their internal model of what the event means. Ancient wisdom simply went deeper into that observation. A Sufi story tells of a man who complained constantly about his suffering. A mystic invited him to sit silently for 1 hour and observe every thought without judgment. After the hour, the man said, "I thought I was suffering from my life, but I was suffering from my thoughts about my life." That distinction is everything, because once awareness shifts inward, something subtle begins to change. Reaction slows, interpretation becomes visible. Emotional patterns lose automatic authority. The individual begins to witness the machinery of perception rather than being fully controlled by it. This is where the ancient teachings meet practice. The perennial philosophy does not ask for blind belief. It invites observation. It suggests a simple but profound discipline. Begin watching your inner reactions daily, not changing them immediately, not suppressing them, just seeing them clearly. Where does fear appear first? Where does judgment arise automatically? Where does interpretation distort neutrality? Where does the mind assume meaning before evidence? These questions slowly expose the architecture of perception itself, and once seen, it cannot be unseen. Because what most people call reality is often a stream of interpretations occurring so rapidly they feel like truth. But they are patterns, learned responses, emotional conditioning, cultural inheritance, personal history repeating itself through perception. The perennial philosophy gently interrupts that automatic flow. It does not remove life. It reveals how life is being constructed internally. And in that recognition, a deeper intelligence becomes available, not as superstition, but as clarity. A space opens between event and interpretation. In that space, consciousness becomes less reactive and more aware. That is the beginning of inner freedom, not escape from reality, but recognition of participation in it. Chapter 8. The illusion of effort. Why does forcing life so often seem to push it further away? Ancient traditions repeatedly warned against a subtle trap, the belief that more force always produces better outcomes. On the surface, effort appears noble, discipline, ambition, persistence. Yet beneath certain forms of effort lies something very different: emotional tension disguised as control. This is where many people unknowingly create resistance instead of results. There is a Taoist teaching that says when a river is chaptered too aggressively, it does not speed up, it floods, stagnates, or diverts entirely. Flow is not absence of movement, it is movement without inner contraction. When the mind grips outcomes too tightly, awareness narrows, options disappear, creativity weakens. Timing becomes distorted, the effort remains but intelligence fades. A young apprentice once approached a Zen master asking how to achieve enlightenment quickly. The master instructed him to sit in meditation and try very hard not to think of a red flower. Immediately, the apprentice's mind became filled with red flowers. The harder he tried, the more the image intensified. After a long silence, the master said, "You see, force creates its own obstacle. This is not philosophy alone, it is psychology. When attention becomes fused with emotional urgency, perception loses flexibility. The mind stops observing reality and begins trying to dominate it. But reality does not respond to pressure in the way objects do. It responds through alignment, through timing, clarity, readiness, and coherent action. Excessive force disrupts coherence. Even in Stoic philosophy, Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminds himself that struggling against what already is produces unnecessary suffering. The Stoic does not abandon action, but refuses emotional war with reality. He acts from clarity, not resistance. He moves from acceptance, not denial. There is a profound difference between effort and force. Effort is aligned action. Force is anxious control. A craftsman shaping wood understands this intuitively. If he presses too aggressively against the grain, the material splits. If he works with the grain, the form emerges smoothly. The wood itself dictates cooperation. Reality behaves similarly. It has structure, timing, and rhythm. Working with it produces flow. Working against it produces friction. Most people are never taught this distinction. They are told only to try harder, push more, never stop forcing progress. But ancient wisdom traditions consistently reveal a hidden truth. Excessive striving often signals misalignment rather than strength. A Sufi poet once wrote, "What you seek is already seeking you, but your haste blinds you." Beneath poetic language lies a psychological insight. Urgency narrows awareness to such a degree that opportunities become invisible. The mind rushing forward often misses what is already present. Desperation collapses perception. Think of someone trying to attract success while internally panicking about failure. Their thoughts are fragmented. Their emotional state oscillates between hope and fear. Their actions become inconsistent. One moment they act confidently, the next they withdraw. This inconsistency disrupts behavioral coherence, which is essential for long-term outcomes. Inner fragmentation weakens external results. Ancient initiates understood this deeply. That is why many traditions emphasized stillness before action. Not inactivity, but clarity before movement. Before speaking, pause. Before deciding, observe. Before forcing outcomes, stabilize perception. Because action arising from chaos produces chaotic results. Action arising from clarity produces alignment. This is the hidden paradox. When emotional desperation decreases, effectiveness often increases. When internal pressure reduces, Perception expands. When attachment loosens, intelligence returns. Solutions that were previously invisible become obvious not because reality changed, but because awareness cleared. Effort becomes lighter, action becomes precise. Even modern performance psychology echoes this ancient insight. Athletes describe flow states where effort feels effortless, time slows, and action becomes instinctive. Musicians report similar experiences where control disappears and expression takes over. In these states, performance is highest precisely when internal struggle is lowest, flow replaces force. So what is actually being taught across Taoism, Stoicism, and Hermetic thought? Not avoidance of effort, but purification of effort, action without anxiety, movement without desperation, intention without emotional collapse, participation without inner resistance. When effort becomes aligned rather than forced, reality no longer feels like something to conquer. It becomes something to cooperate with. And in that cooperation, something remarkable happens. Life stops feeling like a struggle against resistance and begins feeling like a dialogue with intelligence. That is where clarity begins, not in forcing reality to obey, but in removing the inner distortion that made reality appear resistant in the first place. Chapter 9. Why most people manifest their fears. There is a strange pattern in human experience that ancient teachers noticed long before psychology gave it a name. People often end up living inside the very scenarios they are most afraid of, not because fear has magical power, but because fear quietly reorganizes attention, interpretation, and behavior until it becomes a self-conversing loop. This is what Hermetic thinkers, Stoics, and later psychologists all observed through different languages. Consciousness does not just reflect reality, it filters it, rehearses it, and gradually participates in shaping it. Fear is not passive. It is rehearsed imagination with emotional charge. A story from ancient Mesopotamian tradition speaks of a merchant who constantly feared losing his wealth. Every night he imagined thieves, betrayal, market collapse, and ruin. At first it felt like preparation, prudence disguised as vigilance. But over time, something subtle changed. He began avoiding investments. He distrusted partners without cause. He hesitated in decisions that required courage. His business slowed, not because of external collapse, but because his internal world had already begun living in collapse. The fear became a rehearsal, and rehearsal becomes behavior. Modern psychology describes this as attentional bias. The mind begins to selectively notice information that confirms its dominant emotional state. A fearful mind scans for threats. A doubtful mind scans for failure. An insecure mind scans for rejection. Over time, this selective attention does not just change perception, it changes decisions, and decisions shape outcomes. This is why ancient initiates warned against emotional obsession. Not because emotions are dangerous, but because unobserved emotions become repetitive scripts. What you repeatedly feel, you repeatedly simulate. What you repeatedly simulate, you begin to unconsciously act out. Fear narrows consciousness like a closing tunnel. Imagine two individuals walking through the same city. One is calm, attentive, open. He notices opportunities, conversations, subtle invitations in life. The other is anxious, preoccupied with imagined loss. He walks through the same streets but sees only danger, competition, and scarcity. The external world is identical. The internal filter is not. Reality becomes personalized through emotional conditioning. A Sufi teaching describes fear as a borrowed future, a suffering experienced in advance of events that may never occur. Yet the mind, unable to distinguish imagination from reality, responds emotionally as if the feared event is already unfolding. The body reacts, stress increases, perception tightens, behavior shifts, and suddenly, the imagined future begins influencing the present. This is where the loop becomes dangerous, because emotional rehearsal is not harmless thinking, it is training. Every time fear is mentally repeated with intensity, the nervous system learns a pattern. The body begins to recognize that state as familiar. Familiarity becomes default. Default becomes identity. And identity becomes behavior. You do not simply think fear. You begin to inhabit it. Ancient Hermetic texts would say that consciousness dwells where it repeatedly places its attention. Modern neuroscience would say neural pathways strengthen through repetition. Different language. Same mechanism, repetition is architecture. This is why obsession is so destabilizing. When attention locks onto a feared outcome, it creates emotional saturation. The mind no longer observes reality. It continuously projects internal scenarios onto it. Neutral events are interpreted through distortion. Small problems feel catastrophic. Unrelated coincidences feel like confirmation. The world begins to resemble the fear that is being rehearsed internally. A Greek Stoic once wrote that suffering does not come from events themselves, but from judgments about events. Fear is one of the strongest forms of premature judgment. It interprets before evidence arrives. It concludes before experience unfolds, and in doing so, it shapes response. But here is the deeper truth ancient traditions emphasized. Fear does not manifest outcomes directly. It manifests behavior that aligns with outcomes consistent with fear. Someone who fears rejection may behave defensively, pushing others away. Someone who fears failure may avoid opportunity, reducing exposure to success. Someone who fears loss may cling excessively, creating tension in relationships. The fear does not cause the external event. It shapes internal behavior that increases its likelihood. This is how psychological loops become lived reality. The breaking point always begins with awareness, not suppression, not denial awareness. The Hermetic approach was not to fight fear, but to observe it until it loses unconscious authority. When fear is seen clearly, it stops operating invisibly. When it stops operating invisibly, it loses control over automatic behavior. A gap opens between feeling and action. In that gap, freedom appears. An ancient Egyptian initiation story describes a student who was brought into a dim chamber where illusions were projected onto stone walls. Shadows of danger appeared everywhere. Snakes, collapsing structures, attacking figures. The student's instinct was to react, to flee, to resist, but the teacher instructed him, "Do not move, observe only." After a long silence, the student realized something. None of the images were real. They were projections responding to light. The teacher then said, "Your fear is like this room. It projects images, but it is not the world itself." The lesson was psychological clarity. Fear loses power when it is no longer mistaken for truth. So the practical instruction across Hermetic, Stoic, and even modern cognitive traditions is consistent. Stop emotionally feeding fear, not by suppression, but by disengaging from its narrative repetition. Observe it, name it, interrupt its loop, because what is not reinforced begins to weaken, and when fear weakens, perception expands again, opportunities reappear, options return, behavior stabilizes. The mind begins to respond to reality instead of pre-constructing it, and slowly the loop breaks, not through force, but through awareness that refuses to rehearse illusion. Chapter 10. Aristotle and the Architecture of Destiny. If fear shapes the inner distortion of reality, then habit is what slowly solidifies that distortion into form. Aristotle, one of the earliest systematic thinkers on human character, proposed a deceptively simple idea that carries enormous psychological depth. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, therefore, is not an event. It is a pattern. Destiny in this sense is not sudden, it is constructed. A single action may feel insignificant, but repeated thousands of times it becomes identity. And identity becomes the structure through which every future decision is filtered. This is the hidden architecture of human life. Aristotle observed that virtue is not innate perfection, but cultivated behavior. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is the repeated choice to act despite fear. Discipline is not a moment of willpower, it is a trained response that becomes easier over time through repetition. Character is not declared, it is built stone by stone, choice by choice. A story from ancient Athens describes a young man who wished to become a great orator. He admired speeches in the assembly, but struggled with hesitation and doubt. Instead of waiting for inspiration, he adopted a strange discipline. Every day, he would stand alone and speak aloud to no audience, practicing clarity, rhythm, and presence. At first, it felt meaningless. No applause, no recognition, no immediate result. But over time, something shifted. His voice stabilized, his thinking sharpened. His confidence grew not because of external validation, but because of internal repetition. When he eventually spoke in public, he was no longer improvising identity, he was expressing something already formed. This is Aristotle's hidden teaching. Identity follows repetition, not intention. Modern psychology confirms this through habit formation studies. Neural pathways strengthen with repetition, making behaviors more automatic over time. What begins as effort becomes ease. What begins as conscious discipline becomes unconscious identity. Small actions become large destinies. Yet most people underestimate this process because they look for dramatic transformation instead of invisible accumulation. They want sudden breakthroughs while ignoring daily patterns. But ancient wisdom insists the invisible is always becoming visible. A single repeated thought influences emotional tone. A repeated emotional tone influences decision-making. Repeated decisions influence environment. Repeated environment reinforces identity. The cycle is continuous. This is why Aristotle emphasized the importance of excellence as practice rather than inspiration. Excellence is not a peak moment. It is a stable direction of behavior. A person becomes just by repeatedly acting justly. They become disciplined by repeatedly choosing discipline. They become wise by repeatedly reflecting on experience, not perfectly, but consistently. There is also a deeper psychological implication here. Repetition does not just shape behavior, it shapes perception of self. The mind begins to believe what it repeatedly enacts. Someone who repeatedly avoids challenge begins to see themselves as incapable. Someone who repeatedly engages challenge begins to see themselves as capable. Identity is a narrative written through action. Ancient initiates understood this intuitively. That is why their training often focused less on external knowledge and more on disciplined repetition of internal states, attention control, emotional regulation, deliberate speech, and conscious response, because they understood a hidden truth. Whoever controls repetition controls destiny. Even modern life reflects this principle clearly. Financial outcomes are rarely the result of one decision. Relationships are rarely defined by one moment. Success or failure emerges from accumulated micro-behaviors repeated over time. The architecture is subtle, but unbreakable. A Stoic would add another layer. Since we cannot always control external outcomes, we must focus on internal repetition of virtue. This shifts attention from anxiety about results to mastery of process. When process is stable, outcomes eventually align. This is where ancient philosophy becomes practical strategy. If fear creates distortion in perception, then habit creates structure in reality. One destabilizes, the other stabilizes. One reacts, the other builds. And over time, building wins, not because life is controlled externally, but because internal repetition eventually organizes external experience around it. So the real question becomes simple but profound. What are you repeating daily when no one is watching? Because that is where destiny is being formed. Chapter 11. The hidden relationship between identity and reality. There is a quieter law beneath all visible struggle, one that ancient philosophers, mystics, and modern psychologists have circled from different directions, but rarely stated so directly. Reality does not respond to what you want as much as it responds to what you believe you are. Identity precedes experience, not in a mystical sense of wishful thinking, but in a structural sense. Self-concept organizes perception. Perception filters attention. Attention shapes decisions. Decisions accumulate into outcomes, and outcomes reinforce identity again. The loop is continuous, and most people are unaware they are inside it. A story from ancient India describes a young seeker who approached a sage complaining that his life was full of contradiction. "I try to live wisely," he said, "but my life remains chaotic. I try to be disciplined, but I fail repeatedly." The sage observed him for a long moment and then asked a strange question. "Who told you that you are someone who fails?" The seeker was silent. The sage continued, "Before your actions ever changed, you already accepted a definition of yourself, and your life is simply obeying that definition." This is where ancient psychology becomes precise. Identity is not a reflection of behavior. Behavior is a reflection of identity. Modern neuroscience aligns with this. The brain builds predictive models of selfhood. Once a self-image is formed, I am anxious, I am inconsistent, I am capable, I am unlucky, the mind begins selecting perceptions that confirm it. This is not conscious sabotage, it is cognitive efficiency. The mind preserves stability by reinforcing familiar narratives. Even pain becomes familiar if it fits identity. This is why change feels so difficult at a deep level. It is not just behavior resisting transformation. It is identity resisting contradiction. A person who sees themselves as undisciplined may unconsciously disrupt routines that would otherwise create discipline. A person who identifies as unlucky may overlook opportunities that do not match that narrative. The self-image filters reality before action ever begins. Ancient Hermetic teachings suggested something similar. The inner conception of self acts as a template through which experience is interpreted and organized. The external world is not random, it is filtered through expectation shaped by identity. This does not mean reality is imaginary. It means reality is interpreted through a structured lens, and that lens is often invisible. A merchant in ancient Phoenicia once inherited a failing trade route. Everyone around him assumed collapse was inevitable, yet instead of focusing on external conditions alone, he began a subtle internal practice. Each morning, he would deliberately act, speak, and decide as if he were already a successful trader. At first, nothing changed externally, but internally his choices began to shift. He negotiated differently. He observed risks more calmly. He noticed opportunities others dismissed. Within years, the same route that was considered doomed became one of the most profitable in the region. The story is not about luck. It is about identity alignment. He did not wait for success to define him. He embodied the version of himself that could recognize success. This is the hidden mechanism. Identity does not follow results. Identity generates the conditions under which results become possible. That is why emotional embodiment is more powerful than abstract intention. To want success while feeling internally disconnected from being capable creates fragmentation. But to emotionally inhabit the state of capability begins to reorganize perception immediately. Attention shifts, behavior shifts, interpretation shifts. The world appears different because the observer has changed. A Stoic might phrase it differently. Your judgments about yourself determine your experience of the world more than the world itself. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly returned to the idea that the mind becomes what it repeatedly interprets itself to be. This is why ancient initiations often focused on identity dissolution and reconstruction. The old self had to be questioned before a new one could be formed. Not through fantasy, but through disciplined awareness of internal narratives. Because what you assume yourself to be, you unconsciously act out. Even failure is often interpreted through identity rather than event. One person sees failure as confirmation of inadequacy. Another sees it as data for refinement. The event is identical, the identity is not. This is where transformation becomes practical. To shift reality, one must first shift the internal definition of self, not by denying current experience, but by no longer treating current experience as permanent identity. You are not what you are experiencing. You are the consciousness interpreting it. When identity begins to shift, perception reorganizes. Opportunities that were previously invisible become noticeable. Conversations feel different. Emotional reactions soften. Internal resistance decreases. Nothing external has changed yet, but everything internal has. And that is where reality begins to follow. The ancient instruction was simple but profound. Embody the identity you are becoming before external proof arrives. Not as delusion, but as alignment of behavior, attention, and emotional state. Identity is practiced, not declared. And slowly, reality adjusts around the consistency of that practice. Chapter 12. The illusion of separation. There is a deeper fracture beneath most human suffering, one so fundamental that it is rarely questioned. The assumption that the observer and the observed are separate. Ancient non-dual traditions challenged this directly. They suggested that separation is not an absolute truth, but a perceived condition arising within consciousness itself. What you call the world is not outside of awareness, it is appearing within it. This idea appears across cultures in different forms. In the Upanishads it is expressed as the unity of Atman and Brahman, in Taoism as the indivisibility of the Tao, in mystical strands of Sufism as the dissolution of the self into divine unity, in modern philosophy of mind as the problem of subject-object division, different languages. One unsettling implication: separation is experienced, but it may not be ultimately real. A story from ancient Greece tells of a philosopher who spent years studying the nature of perception. One evening, while observing the sea, he noticed something strange. The waves appeared to be separate from him, yet the awareness perceiving them was not separate from anything he could locate. There was seeing, there was movement, but no clear boundary between observer and observed. This realization disturbed him deeply at first. His sense of self felt unstable, as if dissolving, but over time he recognized something more subtle. The suffering created by rigid separation began to soften when the boundary between self and world became less fixed. Fear relies on separation. When there is a strict division between me and everything else, The world becomes something to defend against, control, or resist. But when perception becomes more fluid, experience is no longer interpreted as external threat, but as unfolding within awareness itself. This does not eliminate practical action. It changes the quality of experience from conflict to participation. Modern cognitive science indirectly echoes this through studies of perception. What we call reality is constructed through sensory input, memory, prediction, and interpretation. The brain does not access the world directly, it constructs a model of it. That model feels external, but it is internally generated. This is not philosophical speculation, it is how perception functions. Ancient teachings went further, suggesting that even the sense of I observing experience is part of that construction. The observer is not separate from the observed process. Both arise within consciousness simultaneously. This is where non-dual awareness becomes experiential rather than conceptual. A Sufi mystic once described awakening as the moment when the watcher realizes it was never outside the watched. The implication is not that individuality disappears, but that rigid separation dissolves into a more unified field of experience. In practical terms, this changes how life is lived. When separation is absolute, every challenge feels like external opposition. When separation is softened, challenges are experienced as movements within a larger unfolding process. Reaction slows, judgment decreases, awareness expands. Even emotional pain becomes less personalized. Instead of "this is happening to me," experience is witnessed as "this is happening within awareness." The content of life does not necessarily change, but the relationship to it transforms fundamentally. Ancient Stoics approached a similar realization through discipline rather than metaphysics. By distinguishing between what is within control and what is not, they gradually loosened identification with external events. Suffering decreased not because life became easier, but because resistance softened different path. Similar outcome. The illusion of separation is not something to intellectually erase. It is something to observe directly. When thoughts arise, notice they appear within awareness. When emotions arise, notice they are experienced within awareness. When sensations arise, notice they are known within awareness. Even the sense of I thinking all of this appears within the same field. What remains is simply observation without immediate labeling. And in that observation, something subtle happens. The rigidity of separation begins to lose its grip. Experience becomes less fragmented. Reaction becomes less automatic. Presence becomes more continuous. Ancient traditions would say awareness begins recognizing itself. Modern language might say perception becomes less filtered by rigid self-boundaries. Either way, the effect is the same. Fear loses density, clarity increases, and experience becomes less of a battleground between inner and outer worlds. Instead, life is experienced as a unified unfolding within consciousness itself. And from that recognition, a quieter intelligence emerges, not as belief, but as direct seeing. The illusion of separation does not need to be destroyed. It only needs to be seen clearly enough that it no longer governs perception unconsciously. Chapter 13. The Hermetic Mirror. There is a principle in Hermetic thought that sounds simple until life forces you to confront it repeatedly. The outer world is a mirror of the inner condition, not in a poetic sense. In a psychological one, people often try to fix their lives by attacking the surface: relationships, finances, opportunities, timing, while leaving the deeper patterns untouched. Yet the same emotional reactions, the same assumptions, the same internal narratives continue to regenerate the same external results in new forms, different scenes. Same structure. Ancient initiates understood this, which is why their training rarely began with external mastery. It began with observation of the self. Before temples, rituals, or philosophical systems were used outwardly, they were applied inwardly as disciplines of perception. One Egyptian teaching story describes a novice who complained about disorder in his life. His relationships were unstable, his work inconsistent, his emotions unpredictable. He asked the priest for a ritual to correct his fate. The priest did not give him a ritual. Instead, he gave him silence. For 30 days, the novice was instructed to observe only one thing, his emotional reactions. Not to change them, not to suppress them, only to record when anger appeared, when fear surfaced, when desire distorted clarity, when judgment formed before understanding. At first he thought this was useless, nothing external changed. But slowly, something else became visible. His reactions followed patterns. Certain situations triggered predictable emotional responses. Those responses influenced his decisions. Those decisions reinforced the same outcomes he was trying to escape. He was not living randomly. He was living cyclically, and the cycle began within. This is the hermetic mirror. Internal assumptions reflect outward as repeated life patterns. Modern psychology calls this schema-based perception. The mind organizes experience based on internal models of expectation. If someone assumes they are unworthy, they may unconsciously interpret neutral interactions as rejection. If someone assumes scarcity, they may overlook opportunities. If someone assumes instability, they may unconsciously behave in ways that destabilize stability. Reality does not simply arrive, it is interpreted through internal structure. This is why two people can live in the same environment and experience entirely different worlds. One sees limitation, another sees possibility. One sees rejection, another sees feedback. The external conditions are shared, but the internal filters are not. A Stoic might say, "You are disturbed not by events, but by judgments about events." The Hermetic tradition would go further. Those judgments are not random, they are reflections of deeper internal architecture. A merchant in ancient Corinth once experienced repeated financial collapse despite changing cities, partners, and trades. Each time the external circumstances seemed to be the cause. But after years of failure, he encountered a philosopher who asked him a single question. What do you believe about your own ability to sustain wealth? The question disturbed him more than any economic loss, because he realized that every time success appeared, he subtly expected it to disappear. He invested with hesitation. He made decisions from fear of loss rather than confidence in growth. His external actions mirrored internal instability. The collapse was not external first. It was internal first. And external reality simply followed. This is the uncomfortable clarity of the Hermetic mirror. What repeats in your life is often not happening to you. It is happening through you. Which is why ancient initiates emphasized internal discipline before external expansion. Without inner order, outer success becomes unstable. Without emotional awareness, behavior becomes reactive. Without conscious observation, patterns remain invisible and therefore unchangeable. The first act of transformation is not control, it is recognition. To begin observing emotional triggers is to begin seeing the mechanism beneath behavior. A trigger is not just an emotion, it is a doorway into an underlying assumption. Fear of rejection reveals assumed unworthiness. Anger at delay reveals assumed entitlement to immediate outcomes. Anxiety about loss reveals assumed fragility of stability. Every reaction is informative, not to be judged but to be understood. Because what you can observe clearly you can eventually interrupt. And what you can interrupt, you can eventually recondition. This is how the mirror begins to change, not by attacking the reflection, but by adjusting the source of reflection. And slowly, external life begins to shift, not because the world has been forced to change, but because the internal pattern generating interpretation and behavior has begun to reorganize itself. The hermetic mirror is not punishment, it is feedback. And those who learn to read it stop living as victims of circumstance and begin recognizing themselves as participants in pattern creation. That recognition is the beginning of mastery. Chapter 14. Ignore reality without escaping responsibility. One of the most misunderstood ideas in Hermetic and modern self-inquiry traditions is the notion of ignoring reality. To the untrained mind, this sounds like denial, avoidance, delusion, a refusal to face what is actually happening, but in its deeper sense it means something far more precise. Refusing emotional slavery to appearances while remaining fully responsible for response. There is a difference between seeing reality and being psychologically controlled by it. Ancient Stoics lived this distinction with remarkable clarity. Marcus Aurelius, surrounded by war, plague, and political instability, did not deny the existence of chaos. He simply refused to surrender his inner state to it. External conditions were acknowledged, but not allowed to govern internal coherence. This is not escapism, it is sovereignty. Because reaction and response are not the same thing. Reaction is immediate emotional submission to appearances. Response is conscious interpretation followed by deliberate action. Reaction is automatic. Response is chosen, and the space between them is where freedom exists. A Sufi teaching tells of a man who would become instantly overwhelmed by every hardship he encountered. If business failed, he collapsed emotionally. If someone criticized him, he lost clarity. If plans changed, he became paralyzed. A mystic observed him and said, "You are living as if every wave is the ocean." The man did not understand at first, but the teaching was simple. External events are waves. Consciousness is the ocean. Waves move, ocean remains. To ignore reality in the Hermetic sense is to stop mistaking waves for the totality of existence. It is to recognize that appearances are temporary configurations, not absolute truths. When this distinction is not made, perception becomes reactive. Fear arises from immediate interpretation. Anxiety arises from projected meaning. Confusion arises from lack of distance between event and judgment. But when distance is restored, even slightly, clarity returns. And with clarity, responsibility becomes possible, because responsibility does not mean control over everything. It means conscious participation in how you interpret and respond to everything. A person who reacts unconsciously is controlled by circumstance. A person who responds consciously engages with circumstance from stability. The outer world does not disappear in importance. It loses its authority over identity. This is the key shift. Ancient Hermetic teachings emphasized interpretation as a creative act. What you believe an event means determines how you act within it, and how you act within it determines what unfolds next. This is not magical thinking, it is behavioral causality, interpretation, emotion, action, outcome, Chanthan interpretation, and the entire chain begins to shift. A merchant in Alexandria once lost a shipment of goods at sea. Initially, he interpreted it as catastrophe. Panic followed, but after speaking with a philosopher, he reframed the event not as ending but as redirection of strategy. His emotional state stabilized, his thinking cleared, he rebuilt his trade approach, and eventually recovered greater wealth than before. The event did not change, the interpretation did, and interpretation changed behavior. This is why ancient teachings insist on emotional detachment, not emotional suppression, but emotional non-enslavement. The ability to see clearly without being pulled into immediate reactive identity. Detachment increases clarity. Clarity increases precision. Precision increases effectiveness. This is not mystical abstraction. It is practical psychology. Modern cognitive science confirms that emotional arousal narrows cognitive flexibility. When emotionally overwhelmed, the brain prioritizes survival-based reactions over nuanced reasoning. This is useful in danger but limiting in complex life situations. Ancient wisdom simply recognized this without neuroscience terminology. So, what does ignore reality actually mean in practice? It means, do not let appearance define interpretation. Do not let emotion define truth. Do not let immediate perception define identity. Instead, observe first. Respond second. A stoic pause before reaction is not weakness. It is structural intelligence, because within that pause, automatic patterns lose authority, and conscious choice re-enters the system. This is where responsibility becomes real, not as burden, but as power. You are not responsible for every external event, but you are responsible for the internal interpretation that follows it, and the actions that emerge from that interpretation. And that is where transformation actually occurs, not in escaping reality, but in no longer being emotionally owned by it. Chapter 15. The return to inner sovereignty. There is an ancient story whispered through fragments of Hermetic writings and echoed in forgotten monasteries across Egypt, Greece, Persia, and the deserts of Sufism. It speaks of a time when human beings understood something modern civilization desperately tries to suppress. Consciousness was never meant to be passive. Humanity was not designed merely to react to life, like leaves caught in a storm. Human beings were intended to participate in reality itself. Then the forgetting began. People slowly surrendered inner authority to external conditions. Kings controlled through fear. Merchants controlled through desire. Empires controlled through distraction. Over centuries, the average person stopped governing the inner world and became governed by appearances instead. The Hermetic teachers warned about this collapse long ago. They believed the greatest prison was not physical limitation, but unconscious identification with external circumstances. A distracted mind is easily ruled. This is why ancient initiates spent years mastering thought before seeking influence in the world. In the mystery schools near Alexandria, students were not immediately taught sacred texts. First, they were observed in silence. A teacher would watch how they reacted to insult, uncertainty, praise, temptation, and discomfort. Why? Because uncontrolled emotion revealed uncontrolled consciousness. And uncontrolled consciousness creates chaotic reality. The Stoics understood the same principle centuries later. During plague, political betrayal, and endless war, the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius repeatedly returned to one discipline: govern the inner kingdom before attempting to govern the outer one. He wrote in Meditations that external events do not destroy people. Interpretation destroys people. That insight changed civilizations. Most suffering begins internally first. A man loses money and immediately assumes he is doomed. Another loses money and interprets the event as temporary instruction. One collapses emotionally, while the other reorganizes himself and moves forward stronger than before. The event was similar. The consciousness interpreting it was not. This is the hidden foundation behind what modern people call manifestation, vibration, or reality shifting. Ancient wisdom traditions rarely taught magical control over the universe in the simplistic way modern culture imagines. They taught mastery over perception, identity, emotional atmosphere, and inner order. Those internal forces eventually influence behavior, decisions, relationships, resilience, and opportunity. Reality bends through consciousness indirectly first. Consider how fear alters perception. A fearful mind notices rejection everywhere. It interprets silence as hostility. Delay becomes failure. Small uncertainty becomes catastrophe. Fear narrows awareness until the individual unconsciously creates the very experiences they hope to avoid. Not because the universe is punishing them, but because emotional atmosphere changes interpretation, behavior, energy, posture, focus, and action. The outer world begins reflecting the inner climate. Sufi mystics spoke about this differently. They taught that the ego lives in constant fragmentation because it identifies with temporary conditions rather than deeper consciousness. A person attached entirely to appearances becomes emotionally enslaved to appearances. Praise controls them, rejection controls them, wealth controls them, loss controls them. Their inner state rises and falls with every external shift. That is not sovereignty. True inner sovereignty emerges when awareness becomes deeper than circumstance. The Taoists called this alignment with the Tao. The Stoics called it reason aligned with nature. Hermetic teachers called it harmony with divine mind. Different language. Same truth, the deeper intelligence already exists within you. But modern life trains people away from this awareness constantly. Every distraction fragments attention. Every emotional overreaction weakens internal stability. Every unconscious habit reinforces reactive living. Most people do not consciously choose their mental environment anymore. Algorithms choose it. Fear-based media chooses it. Social pressure chooses it. Emotional impulses choose it. And scattered consciousness produces scattered results. There is a reason ancient initiates protected silence so fiercely. Silence allowed them to hear the architecture of their own thinking. Most modern people are terrified of silence because silence exposes the condition of the inner world. Noise becomes escape. Endless stimulation becomes anesthesia. Yet the moment a person becomes still long enough to observe themselves honestly, transformation begins. A businessman once traveled to a remote monastery after losing nearly everything he owned. He expected mystical rituals or hidden techniques. Instead, the old teacher gave him a simple instruction. Observe your reactions for 30 days before trying to change your life. The man became frustrated immediately. He wanted external solutions. Instead, he discovered something disturbing. Every day he unconsciously rehearsed defeat internally. Every conversation became proof of limitation. Every obstacle confirmed hopelessness. His external life was not merely harming his inner world. His inner world was reinforcing his external life continuously. Awareness changed everything. By the end of those 30 days, nothing external had radically changed yet, but his emotional atmosphere had become calmer, clearer, and more deliberate. Decisions improved, relationships softened. Opportunities appeared where fear once chaptered perception. He later admitted the greatest transformation was not financial recovery. It was reclaiming authority over his own consciousness. This is the return to inner sovereignty. It is not pretending problems do not exist. It is refusing to become psychologically possessed by them. There is enormous difference between acknowledging reality and surrendering identity to reality. Hermetic wisdom never taught denial. It taught mastery of interpretation. The inner world is the command center. Every repeated thought strengthens emotional patterns. Every emotional pattern influences behavior. Every behavior reinforces identity. Every identity shapes destiny slowly over time. This process happens whether consciously directed or not. Most people simply participate unconsciously, but consciousness changes the equation. The moment you deliberately observe your thoughts instead of automatically obeying them, you weaken old conditioning. The moment you consciously redirect emotional energy instead of feeding destructive reactions, you begin reclaiming creative authority. The moment you stop asking circumstances for permission to feel stable internally, you step into psychological freedom. Small internal victories matter immensely. Aristotle once explained that excellence is not an isolated act, but repeated habit. Ancient Hermetic teachings agreed completely. Destiny is rarely created through one dramatic moment. It is shaped through repeated internal patterns becoming fixed character over time. A peaceful mind sees possibilities faster. A disciplined mind wastes less energy. An emotionally stable mind interprets reality differently. This is why inner mastery eventually becomes external influence. People trust calm individuals during chaos. Opportunities move toward clarity instead of desperation. Relationships improve around emotional steadiness. Focus sharpens decision-making. Attention strengthens execution. Internal order projects outward naturally. The world responds differently to governed consciousness. There is a final realization hidden beneath all Hermetic philosophy: Stoicism, Taoism, Sufism, and non-dual awareness traditions. The goal was never domination over reality. The goal was alignment with deeper intelligence through inner order. Ancient masters understood something modern culture often forgets. Power without self-mastery becomes self-destruction. The first kingdom is within. So beginning today, govern your thoughts deliberately. Observe emotional reactions before feeding them. Refuse unconscious mental slavery to appearances. Protect your attention as if it shapes destiny, because eventually it does. Inner sovereignty is not fantasy, it is disciplined consciousness practiced daily. Chapter 16. The Final Law of Conscious Reality. Imagine waking every morning unaware that your thoughts are quietly rehearsing your future, not through mystical fantasy alone, but through something more subtle and dangerous: emotional atmosphere. The ancient Hermetic teachers believed human beings continuously radiate internal conditions outward through interpretation, focus, behavior, and attention. Most people wait for external reality to determine their state of mind. Hermetic wisdom reversed the equation entirely, or state comes first. This final law was considered too powerful for careless minds because it forced individuals to accept responsibility for the invisible climate they carried within themselves daily. According to Hermetic philosophy, thoughts do not remain isolated events floating harmlessly in the mind. Repeated thoughts become emotional patterns. Emotional patterns become perception filters. Perception influences action. Action shapes destiny over time. The cycle repeats endlessly. A fearful person unconsciously searches for danger. A bitter person notices betrayal everywhere. A hopeful person sees opportunities hidden inside difficulty. Reality itself may contain all possibilities simultaneously, but consciousness determines which possibilities become psychologically visible. This is why two people can live through identical events and emerge completely different. One becomes hardened and hopeless. Another becomes wiser and stronger. One feeds emotional chaos internally, while the other develops emotional discipline. Ancient initiates understood this deeply. They knew external conditions alone did not shape human destiny. Interpretation shaped destiny. Consciousness organizes experience. In the corpus hermeticum, reality is often described as layered and responsive, rather than fixed and mechanical. Modern people misunderstand this idea constantly. They imagine magical thinking instead of psychological participation. But the deeper hermetic insight is more profound. Internal awareness changes how reality is experienced, navigated, interpreted, and influenced. And that changes outcomes dramatically. Think about someone trapped in chronic anger. Their body tightens constantly. Their attention searches for disrespect. Relationships deteriorate through unconscious hostility. Decision-making becomes reactive. Even neutral events become emotionally charged. Eventually, their external world begins reflecting the emotional atmosphere they continuously reinforce internally. The same principle works in reverse. A person cultivating steadiness, gratitude, focus, and emotional awareness behaves differently. They notice possibilities faster. They recover from setbacks quicker. They communicate more effectively. They build trust naturally. Their inner climate quietly reorganizes their external experience over time. Ancient sages called this vibration not merely mystical energy, but the quality of consciousness itself. Every tradition pointed toward this understanding differently. Taoism taught alignment over force. Stoicism taught mastery over interpretation. Sufism taught dissolving the fearful ego to reconnect with divine awareness. Non-dual philosophy taught that separation itself is partly illusion. The perennial philosophers later observed that beneath cultural differences, many traditions were pointing toward one central realization. Consciousness shapes human reality profoundly. But modern society rarely trains people to examine consciousness carefully. It trains reaction instead. Endless stimulation fragments attention until people become strangers to their own inner world. Most individuals know more about celebrity scandals than their own emotional patterns. They can describe world events in detail, yet remain unaware of the thoughts dominating their lives every morning. Unobserved thought becomes destiny silently. This is why the ancient schools emphasized awareness practices constantly. Observation weakens unconscious programming. Attention reveals patterns previously hidden beneath emotional habit. Once a person becomes aware of recurring reactions, transformation becomes possible. Awareness interrupts automatic living. A woman once visited an old spiritual teacher after years of failed relationships. She believed life had cursed her repeatedly. The teacher listened quietly before asking one question: "What emotional atmosphere do you carry into every relationship before it even begins?" The question disturbed her deeply. Over weeks of reflection, she realized she entered every connection expecting abandonment. That expectation shaped communication, sensitivity, fear, jealousy, and behavior unconsciously. She was not intentionally creating suffering, but her inner atmosphere influenced her perception constantly. The hidden pattern became visible. That visibility changed her life more than advice ever had. Once awareness illuminated the emotional cycle, she could consciously interrupt it instead of feeding it automatically. This is the true beginning of transformation, not denial. Awareness, hermetic wisdom repeatedly returns to one central warning: whatever controls attention eventually controls identity. And identity shapes reality through repeated thought, emotion, behavior, and interpretation. This is why disciplined awareness matters more than temporary motivation. Motivation fades, awareness observes. Temporary excitement cannot compete with unconscious emotional habits repeated for years. But daily observation slowly dissolves those patterns. The moment a person notices destructive reactions without immediately obeying them, consciousness expands beyond conditioning. Freedom begins there. So the ancient teachers often prescribed simple but demanding practices. Observe thoughts daily. Watch emotional triggers carefully. Notice recurring fears. Study reactions without judgment. Become aware of inner dialogue. Protect attention from fragmentation. Govern mental atmosphere deliberately. These small disciplines reshape consciousness gradually. And gradual transformation becomes permanent transformation. This leads to the final experiment. For the next 30 days, observe yourself honestly. Not the world first, yourself. Watch recurring emotional patterns. Notice which thoughts dominate your mornings. Observe how fear alters perception. Study how anger changes decision-making. Watch how repeated assumptions influence behavior throughout the day. Do not condemn yourself. Just observe carefully. You may discover that many external struggles were strengthened internally through unconscious repetition. You may notice how emotional attachment to appearances magnifies suffering. You may realize that attention itself functions like creative energy, strengthening whatever it repeatedly feeds. And slowly, something extraordinary begins happening. You stop reacting automatically. You become calmer under pressure. You notice possibilities faster. You recover emotional balance quicker. You think more deliberately. You become less controlled by appearances. That is the beginning of conscious reality, not fantasy, not blind denial, not magical escapism. Conscious participation in the shaping of perception, identity, emotion, and behavior. The ancient Hermetic masters believed this inner transformation eventually radiated outward into every area of life, because the outer world often mirrors the inner one quietly. And the final law is simple enough to remember for the rest of your life. What controls your attention eventually controls your reality.